uh, just I just want to welcome everybody here to the virtual book launch of the third edition of Rethinking Multicultural Education. Um, before we even get going here, I want to make sure to give a huge thank you to our ASL interpreters, Tierra Carter and Crystal Butler. I know ASL interpretation is super hard. I also know I talk super fast. So my apologies in advance, and I will work on speaking more slowly. So today's event is really sort of an intro to the book. I'm happy to be here. I'm going to be talking through some big picture stuff around the book. And also then we have a few Rethinking Schools editors and folks from the Rethinking Schools team who are also contributors to the third edition of Rethinking Multicultural Education. And they're going to spend some time talking about their pieces, their contributions, and how they see this sort of fitting into the struggle for anti-racist education in our curriculum in schools. For me, doing this book, this third edition, I've never done a third edition before. And it's interesting to look back at something, this book has a 2024 publication date. The publication date of the second edition was 2014, and the first edition came out in 2009. So we're looking at nearly 15 years ago is when the first edition came out. And it's kind of amazing to look back across that time and think about how much things have changed, both at Rethinking Schools, but also sort of in the field of education, and how we think about like teaching for social justice and anti-racist education and the kind of movements around them. Back in 2009, when I first put the first edition together, it was interesting and almost surprising that at that time, while Rethinking Schools did have book collections around how do we teach for justice, because that's always what we've been about and what we've done for well over 30 years now, we didn't actually have a book collection that focused on how do we think about teaching about race and culture and anti-racism in the classroom. And so it was a chance to sort of collect these pieces that we've had in Rethinking Schools up to that time, and then put it together, right? But then think about it. 2009 was feels like forever ago to me at this point. And even since like between that first edition and between the second edition, we saw huge changes, right? Common Core was just coming up, in 2009. We're back in the Obama presidency if we go back to that time, right? Even though, and we were still in the No Child Left Behind era, but folks were kind of moving out of that phase towards Common Core. And a lot of things that we take for granted now weren't even sort of in our lexicon. So for instance, back then, folks were not regularly using their pronouns, and my pronouns are he and him, by the way, when they were in public discussions and political discussions. It was something that we weren't registering in the same kind of way. And then the second edition comes out in 2014, right? And again, that's almost 10 years from now. I'm thinking it's between here and there, right? We had the banning of the Mexican American Studies program in Tucson. Common Core hits its stride and really starts to sort of move across the country. There was the 2012, there was the Chicago's Teachers Union strike, excuse me, that really sort of laid a lot of groundwork on how we think about social justice union organizing with teachers across the country, and created this sort of whole legacy. And then even since then, since 2014, since the last edition, we've seen two huge rounds of Black Lives Matter protests across this country. And that actually became the basis for really a big push for anti-racist education around Black Lives Matter at school, right? We've seen local and state level and even at school level movements around implementing K-12 ethnic studies. That's been a big piece. And there's been, Standing Rock and the Sioux-led protests against the Code Access pipeline, right? We've had politics around around gender and sexuality and queerness, like really just sort of expand and really complicate things even more in such beautiful ways since that time, right? And there's been other union struggles around the country. Like things have changed massively across these last 15 years, right? Then also we faced, in more recent times, we faced a really strong reactionary backlash to this work we've seen across the country, not only harkening back to the Trump administration, but also we've seen sort of this neo-fascist movement against, against multiculturalism and diversity, against queer studies, against trans students and their families, like, right, critical race theory, or whatever these jokers think critical race theory is. And so we've been experiencing this huge backlash to this stuff, right? And so this book really comes out of all those kinds of changes, right? We have language now that we couldn't use before. It's also interesting for me to think about, like, I think thanks to the Black Lives Matter movement, we can use the term white supremacy more regularly and in more mainstream ways than we used to, right? Yes, the huge uptick in book bannings in schools. Like, we have a different kind of lexicon available to us and how we speak about these things. And so this new book, the new edition, really reflects all these changes. And so ultimately, the third edition of Rethinking Multicultural Education, it's literally like, I don't know, 93% new pieces compared to the second edition. We've had so much material in Rethinking Schools since 2014, so much new pieces on teaching so much stuff around like intersectionality, and I mean, just so many different aspects around good multicultural anti-racist education, that in the end, when I revisited the table of contents and realized what we had published across this time, the work we've done in Black Lives Matter, the work we've done in ethnic studies, so much stuff that really needed, like, all the new stuff had to be in here. Not all of it, but I needed to really sort of revamp what we had. And it was just funny for me to think, as one last point, that even having the title multicultural education, having the words multicultural education in the title, in some ways feels passé. That's like, feels like very old language for us. But I'm committed to sort of keeping the language and sort of the brand of the book going forward, and just making sure that the contents really address all the shifts that we have, right? And so in terms of the content, just as a couple of things, the overall, just the sections are still big. Some of the sections are still the same from the previous edition. We have anti-racist orientations, which I sort of see as foundational text to sort of get folks to be thinking about how do we approach this work. And then a new section called intersectional identities, where I really wanted to focus on how do we see gender and sexuality and other aspects of our identities really intersect with race and culture, and what does that mean in terms of classroom practices. I kept another section, which is section 3, language, culture, and power, right? But it has a bunch of new pieces compared to the older edition, things speaking to indigenous languages, for instance. And then an expansive new section, the 4th section, anti-racist teaching across the curriculum. And really it looks at cross grade level, cross ages, across subject areas. How do we see this work sort of in practice? And then the final 2 sections really reflect a couple of our other books. One small section is Teaching for Black Lives, that actually has mostly things that aren't in that aren't in our book, Teaching for Black Lives, but it has pieces that are about doing teaching for Black lives in the classroom, and then a few pieces from our ethnic studies book as well, because I felt like I couldn't have stuff on doing anti-racist education and not explicitly acknowledge the importance of those 2 movements in schools for this work. So anyways, that's sort of a big picture piece of the book. Again, thank you all for being here. And now I'm going to kick it over to longtime friend and Rethinking Schools editor and author and an amazing person, Bill Bigelow. Bill, you are officially up. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, Wayne, thank you. Well, first of all, isn't that a beautiful book? I love that. Wayne, let me just start out by huge thanks for doing the heavy lifting on this. I was thinking also about, I was going back and like you, I went back and realized that the first edition came out in 2009. And just thinking about the thousands of teachers and teacher educators and student teachers who have been reached by the Rethinking Multicultural Education work, and just had their practice shaped by it. And I just, I just love the fact that this is continuing, and so much appreciate all the work you put into this. The other thing that I want to appreciate about what Wayne did here is the first chapter in the book, Taking Multicultural Anti-Racist Education Seriously, which is a conversation between anti-racist educator Enid Lee, and was an interview, and with our former managing editor, Barbara Miner. And it's one of my favorite articles in the history of Rethinking Schools. And it first came out in the fall of 1991. And, we've used it in workshops, and it's just been around forever. And Enid very graciously allowed us to reproduce it for this year, in Rethinking Schools magazine, and expanded it as well. So the piece in here is new and old at the same time. And there's a passage of Enid that I wanted to read because it's just stuck with me, and I think it has real relevance for the moment that we find ourselves in, and the right-wing attack on anti-racist education. Enid says, "I remember a teacher telling me last summer that after she listened to me on the issue of racism, she felt ashamed of who she was. And I remember wondering if her sense of self was founded on a sense of superiority. Because if that's true, then she is going to feel shaken. But if her sense of self is founded on working with people of different colors to change things, then there is no need to feel guilt or shame." And, that just has stuck with me. And, if you think about, the premise of so much of the attack, the right-wing attack on anti-racist teaching, there's this claim that white kids are going to feel shame, they're going to feel guilt. And, Enid says, no, the book says no, that, that this is an invitation. This is an invitation to feel ourselves as connected to this long current of anti-racist struggle in US history. And if we feel ourselves as part of that, we don't feel guilt, we don't feel shame, we do feel responsibility, particularly as white people in that, but we don't feel guilt or shame. And I think that this is just, Enid's piece, I just have to say, is worth the price of the book. And so just a little commercial note there. So just a brief story I have a very short piece in the book, but so Cierra Kaler-Jones and Jesse Hagopian, Adam Sanchez, Ursula Wolfe-Rocca, and I were all back at the National Council for the Social Studies conference in Nashville. And earlier this year, we ran an article in Rethinking Schools by 4 Tennessee teacher educators based in Memphis on the chilling effect of the attack on anti-racist education there, what they call the prohibited concepts in instruction law. Just think about how creepy that is. Prohibited concepts in instruction. And so their article is about the chilling effect. And so there we are in Tennessee. And so at the Zinn Education Project booth, I would ask Tennessee teachers, well, what effect is this legislation having on you? And one teacher came by, a woman from a rural Tennessee district. And I asked her, and she said, well, in my district, the school board went through all our history standards, the standards that we're supposed to be teaching, and they identified what they called danger zones. And I said, well, what would be an example of a danger zone? And she said, well, one was the Harlem Renaissance. So basically, any moment, any episode, any era in US history that put the lives of Black people or people of color at the center was an area that they would put a warning label on. So stay away from that. You're skating on thin ice around there. Even those were part of the standards. And so it was just this one little kind of corner, one little glimpse at how this new McCarthyism is playing out. My piece is chapter 5. And Wayne, by the way, I noticed that it's arguably the shortest piece in Rethinking Schools that I've written in the last 10 years. So don't think I didn't notice that. But it's got the sort of unsexy, uncatchy title of "The Attack on Anti-Racist Teaching is an Attack on Environmental Justice Teaching." And I think that obviously the main thrust of the right wing is going after anti-racist teaching. But environmental justice teaching is also collateral damage there. So if you think about, well, what is environmental justice teaching? It centers the lives of the people who are hardest hit by the climate catastrophe, by the environmental crisis more broadly. People in Flint, Michigan drinking water with lead in it. People in the Marshall Islands facing the twin crises of rising seas and possibly disappearing homelands, as well as the ongoing toxicity of nuclear testing from the 1950s and 1960s there. Oregon farm workers who had to go to work in the most toxic air in the world during a period of time in 2020, and then in 2021 having to go to work in it was 118 degrees in Northwest Oregon, and where people are having to work in this. So we center the lives of people who are hardest hit, and we look for the deep roots of the crisis. We find them in the in systems of colonialism, of racism, of capitalism, of militarism, and crucially, what environmental justice needs to focus on is resistance and activism. Because if we don't, when we teach about the enormity of the environmental crisis, and we don't encourage kids to see themselves as activists, as people who can make a difference, to kind of find their efficacy, then we run the risk of turning our classrooms into little, dens of despair or factories for cynicism. And so I just want to share one, in my article, I identify a piece of legislation in Texas that, again, it's going after anti-racist teaching, but environmental justice teaching is collateral damage in that. And it's just this breathtaking law. House Bill 3979 became law at the end of 2021. And it's worded in such a convoluted way. But just let me read a bit of it and just grasp the sweeping prohibition of activism, student activism in the bill. No school district or teacher shall require, make part of a course, or award course grading or credit, including extra credit, for political activism, lobbying, or efforts to persuade members of the legislative or executive branch to take specific actions by direct communication at the local, state, or federal level, or any practicum or like activity, whatever that means, involving social or public policy advocacy. I mean, just think about that for a moment. Just pause and think about that. It outlaws any student activism. So, it's this sweeping curricular gag order that is, it's just educational malpractice. And so, when we find ourselves in these situations, I mean, we can, we have a choice. We either comply or we defy. And I think that, we need to find each other in the defiance that this is, I don't need to tell folks, this is an incredibly hard time in the world. It's an incredibly hard time in education. And, educators of conscience, we need to find one another. We need to support each other through Rethinking Schools, through the Zen Education Project, through Teaching for Change, through all the conferences that we've created, through our unions. And so, you know, we just, this is a moment. This is a moment when we have to find each other. This is a moment where we have to kind of metaphorically hold hands, because it's just such a tough time. And also we need to rely on the collected wisdom in a resource like Rethinking Multicultural Education. And so, you know, thanks for everybody being here. Thanks for your support of Rethinking Schools.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm so thrilled to be here. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Wayne, for this beautiful book. I just have to follow Bill's suit and just show it again, because it is so beautiful. It's so powerful, story rich, practical. This really is such an incredible text. And I'm honored to be among this group of editors and contributors to this book. It feels like a very full circle moment for me, because I've long looked to Rethinking Schools text, and particularly previous editions of the book, for inspiration, for grounding, hope, and tangible teaching ideas. And this is the first time that an article that I wrote appears in a Rethinking Schools book. So I'm really grateful to be able to share space with all of you, to celebrate this moment for Rethinking Schools, and also to celebrate all of the possibility and all of the potential of what it means when we come together in collaboration. So as I think about the article that I wrote, my piece through the lens of those we love, uplifting oral histories and finding common threads, I want to share with a quick quote from the article. History is not only around us, but also within us. It is not something that just takes place in textbooks or out there, but rather something that we make each day. History is etched into the fabric of our loved ones' beings, and we can breathe life into the stories that make up the essence of who we are, individually and collectively, by exploring our stories, communicating them, and passing them on. So this piece is about how my co-researchers, who are high school aged Black girls, and we collected oral history testimonies from our loved ones. In this piece, I also share some possibilities for how to teach oral histories using the incredible book by Clint Smith, How the Word is Passed. He has a few poems in the book, including one called We Can Learn This History, that offers some possibilities to the question, who can we learn history from? And so amid the COVID-19 pandemic, my co-researchers and I recognize that the moment that we are living in is history that will be cataloged for centuries to come. And so we carefully watched the news in the summer of 2020. We debunked myths that we saw on social media and lamented how history textbooks might illustrate the compounding factors of the pandemic, continued racial injustice and subsequent rebellion, and an ongoing climate crisis. And we didn't want our experiences to be forgotten in the textbook, because our experience had been that our stories had been erased. So we started to explore the question, if we rewrote history textbooks, what stories would we want to tell? And so the group decided that they wanted to interview their loved ones, their moms, their grandmas, their aunties, their cousins. And so I guided them through the process of developing a collective interview protocol with questions that would open up conversation. And so some of their questions were, what are your outlets for expression? What causes are you passionate about? And if you were going to be in a textbook, what would you want to say to readers? As they collected their interview data, they came back to our community space where we began to code and analyze that data. We had this collaborative Google Doc, and I asked each co-researcher to pick their favorite color and highlight words and phrases, themes and ideas that came up more than once. And so we had this Google Doc that had all of these different words on it. And I asked them, what do you notice? What do you wonder? And so one theme that they came up with was racism. For example, one of the co-researchers, Brianna, said, I realized that it wasn't only individual acts of racism that they experience, but it was also from different institutions like school and the workplace. Also, many of the people we interviewed came from different places, so it's something much bigger than the individual acts of racism that they were experiencing. They started to weave the threads of the stories together to see how structural and systemic racism and oppression impacted their loved ones and their stories. They began to analyze and name these actual patterns just from not only the individual interviews that they were having with their loved ones, but when we brought them all together, we could see the individual stories and the collective stories, the collective experience. Another thing that they saw as a theme was resistance. Like Bill was just talking about, our collective defiance. They saw resistance come up. So Lisa, one of the co-researchers, said, "We resist these negative stories by sharing our art and our stories." She said, "Black history isn't just full of suffering. They should explain a lot more of the successes that are in our history and that make us who we are. Not everything is just suffering for us. There's joy, art, and love too." And for me, this is the power of anti-racist education: to tell the truth about structural and systemic patterns of oppression, to provide opportunities and tools for students to be in critical dialogue about the world around them, what it means, what it looks like, how they experience it, how they interact with it, but also how their communities, their loved ones, have interacted with it. But to me, it also means highlighting and regarding and centering the importance of humanity, the things that make us who we are. To push back on racism in our teaching also means that we share stories of solidarity, of resistance, community, and laughter. I look forward to more opportunities to being able to come together to do this work, to learn from one another, to lean on one another, because that is the power of the collective, and that's the power of us. With that, I'll pass it over to my comrade Jesse to share more about the article that he and Adam Sanchez wrote about Black Panther Party, bringing us to that critical history. Thank you all so much. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Cierra. That was beautiful. Really appreciate you sharing that. And thank you to Wayne for including the lesson that Adam Sanchez and I wrote about the Black Panther Party. This is a really gorgeous book, and there's just so much in here that is going to help classrooms all across the country. So congratulations on getting this out. And I just wanted to share a little bit about our chapter on the Black Panther Party. It's called "What We Don't Learn About the Black Panther Party But Should." And Christopher Rufo, who launched the language of critical race theory in right-wing circles to try to gather together everything that they're scared of to attack. Christopher Rufo said in a recent interview that the ideology of the Black Panther Party has been thoroughly integrated into the US public school system. And yeah, I think it's probably been about as integrated as a school in Virginia in the 1950s. It's what an astounding lie that is, because even though there's so many vital lessons of the Black Panther Party for our youth today to think about how to confront racism and police violence, corporate textbooks today misrepresent, minimize, completely erase the significance of the Black Panther Party. Oftentimes, the Panthers are left out of textbooks altogether. When they do talk about the Panthers, the textbooks often associate the Panthers with violence or separatism. So I'll give you an example. There's a textbook called History Alive. Probably never been a more ironic title to a book. History Alive says, quote, Black power groups formed that embraced militant strategies and the use of violence. Organizations such as the Black Panther Party, organizations such as the Black Panthers rejected all things white and talked of building a separate Black nation. Now, a lot of things written about the Panthers omit key facts or distort aspects of their legacy, but some just promote outright lies like this one. In fact, the Black Panther Party did not reject all things white. They built key alliances with white organizations. Like in California, they had an electoral strategy organizing with the Peace and Freedom Party that was a predominantly white organization. In Chicago, Fred Hampton helped organize the Black Panther Party into the Rainbow Coalition, which included the Young Patriots, which was a white radical organization. And in fact, the Panthers did not call for separatism, for Black separate nation. The Panthers had socialist politics and wanted to see working people of all races unite. So the main framework that corporate textbooks use to tell the story of the Black Panthers and the Black Power movement more broadly is that after Martin Luther King was assassinated, militants hijacked the civil rights movement and basically just drove it into the ground. They say this is the narrative that because these militants were in control, the movement declined. Instead of analyzing how the co-option and state violence and COINTELPRO were used to destroy the vibrant organizations of the Black freedom struggle, they blame it on people more forthrightly struggling for freedom. And the truth about the Panthers is that there's an important continuity between the Black Panthers and earlier organizations in the civil rights movement. The Panthers didn't develop out of thin air. They evolved from their relationship with civil rights organizations, especially the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And, armed with their revolutionary socialist ideology, they fought in Black communities across the nation for giving poor people access to decent housing, healthcare, education, and so much more, right? Pretty much the only thing that the textbooks talk about the Panthers is when they were policing the police, right? And they emphasize the armed struggle. But the main work of the Black Panther Party was actually creating the free breakfast programs, the free healthcare clinics, and the rest of the survival programs, 30, 40 other free programs that they brought to their communities. So we've developed a lesson that we introduce students to the politics and the people of the Black Panther Party through a mixer activity. And students learn about some of the bigger names in the Black Panther Party, people like the founders of the party, Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, the incredible artists who did the artwork for the Black Panther Party newspaper, Emory Douglas. We also want to make sure we introduce them to the women of the Black Panther Party, like Elaine Brown, who became the head of the entire organization, or Kathleen Cleaver or Erica Huggins, who started the Oakland Community School, the Black Panther Party School, or often my students' favorite character is Afeni Shakur, Tupac's mom. And they're excited to learn that she was in the Panthers. So we do a mixer activity. Students get lots of different roles of all these different people who were part of the Black Panther Party, but also people who were allies of the Black Panther Party who weren't in the party, but who worked alongside them. People like Cha-Cha Jimenez, who was organizer with the Young Lords, or William Preacher Man, who was an organizer with the Young Patriots, the white organization that Fred Hampton partnered with. And students learn about all these different organizers across the country who were building a revolutionary socialist approach to the Black freedom struggle. And then they go around the room and they try to find someone. They have a scavenger hunt sheet that asks them to find someone in the room who can tell you about one of the central beliefs of the Black Panthers, who has an opinion about the role of women in the Black Panther Party, and even find someone who opposed the Black Panther Party, because there are a couple of characters who helped organize COINTELPRO, so the students can learn that it was state violence that brought down the Black freedom struggle organizations of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, not their quest for freedom. So I hope everyone will check that lesson out and let us know how it goes in your classroom. And I'm excited for it to reach broader audiences. Thank you.
Hi, friends. I'm up next. I teach that Black Panthers mixer, so I can endorse it 100%. So for those who don't know me, my name is Ursula Wolfe-Rocca. I'm an editor at Rethinking Schools. I'm also a high school teacher, and I'm sitting in my classroom right now. So school got out just about an hour ago, and I didn't have time to make it home. So I am Zooming in from my classroom. And I hope that folks will forgive me, because I am going to end up talking more as a reader of Rethinking Multicultural Education than as a contributor. So I too am going to hold up the beautiful new cover. So of course I am super honored, and thank you, Wayne, to be included in this volume. But right now I really am just going to speak more as a consumer than as a contributor. So I am in the midst of my 21st year in the classroom, and I think it may be my hardest year yet. I am struggling, y'all. And you know what I have done more times than I can count this year is to grab a Rethinking Schools book. And I have reached for them for inspiration, for guidance, and perhaps most importantly, to affirm that while I may be sitting alone in my classroom at the end of a long, hard day, I'm not, in fact, alone in this project of trying to teach for justice and with care at the center. So let's just stipulate that the job of being a social justice educator is structurally impossible. But it's absolutely also true that our best hope for meaningful action comes when we recognize that we cannot, literally cannot, do this work alone. Through collections like Rethinking Multicultural Education, I can feel like I am holding hands with other educators, to use a phrase that Bill used earlier. In those desperate moments of, holy moly, what am I going to teach tomorrow? And truly, holy moly, what am I going to teach tomorrow? I'm not quite sure yet. I can feel like I am digging through not just my own folders of curriculum and teaching ideas, but also through Bill Bigelow's and Jesse Hagopian's and Wayne Au's and Linda Christensen's and Moé Yonamine's and all the other contributors to Rethinking Multicultural Education, as well as all the other wonderful Rethinking Schools collections. So, you know, why do I reach for Rethinking Schools stuff? Why do I reach for Rethinking Multicultural Education? What you will not find in Rethinking Multicultural Education are the kinds of materials marketed by textbook publishers. materials that seem eerily anonymous, as if they were created by no one in particular, for no one in particular, in no particular historic time or geographic place. The resources you find in RME are precisely the opposite. They are grounded in the teaching lives of their authors, developed and practiced in specific communities and classrooms, and happening as part of history, not outside of it. So now I am going to talk for a second about the piece, one of the pieces that I have in the book, which is chapter 27. So when Andrew Duden, Bill Bigelow, and I gathered in my dining room in 2016 to talk about how we might bring the drama and energy of the Standing Rock protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline into our classrooms, it was because we knew something important, historic, was happening there. As I have taught the role play that's featured in Rethinking Multicultural Education in subsequent years, I have found that its major themes, broken treaties, native sovereignty, the fight against fossil fuels, and for environmental justice, continue to pulse with relevance. At the same time, the story cannot be frozen in 2016, 2017. You know, history continues to unfold and the fight continues. So this book and the materials that I contributed to this book are also, as I see them, an invitation. These essays, articles, and lessons are inviting you to borrow some ideas and strategies and materials, not to follow them like a script, but to join us as collaborators, adapting them, tailoring them to your students, your classroom, and to this always shifting historical moment. So speaking of this historical moment, just as I invited a group of educators into my dining room in Portland, Oregon in 2016 to build curriculum on Standing Rock, I know there are educators meeting right now, or if not actually meeting, hatching plans in a group chat to figure out how to teach against the US facilitated genocide unfolding in Gaza. That is urgent and will take all of us. Ceasefire now, free Palestine, end the occupation. For us, these cannot just be chants in the streets. They also demand that we do what educators do, continue to build the kind of curricula and stories and classrooms that are featured in this book. And that is curricula and classrooms against apartheid, against settler colonialism, against militarism and war, and for joy, justice, and lasting peace. And so for me, being part of this book is an example of solidarity of educators across time and space. And being on this webinar with all of you is an exercise in solidarity as well. And I just want to thank Wayne for making it possible, and thank you all for being here. I am honored to be part of this. And I'm going to pass it off to my dear friend and teaching comrade, Moé Yonamine.
Thank you so much. I'm feeling all kinds of emotions just hearing Ursula speak. So I'm going to do my best to exhale and push through here. I think similar to what my friends have already said, this book is like breathing air in at a time where I find myself holding my breath a lot as a teacher. And some of my friends that are on the call right now know we've talked about this quite a bit, but that tension and being a teacher in today's time, it's like a balance between keeping it real, serving our students, especially the students that are underrepresented in our classrooms, and then trying to figure out how we survive in the teaching field. When I was doing my master's in teaching, I don't think I ever got a lesson in how to keep myself safe as a teacher of color, knowing that I was going to teach racial justice and social justice curriculum, that I would have to be careful of my internet presence, be careful for the safety of my children, be careful to not put my face too much out there as an ethnic studies teacher. And I know that this is so real for so many of us each and every day. And that feels like weight on my chest on some days so much that it's hard to get back up. And I turn to Rethinking Schools like there are hands on my back and that I'm not alone, no matter if I'm navigating the school building or racist folks, anti-CRT rants, or sometimes creeping into the classroom with children that will parrot some of the things, horrible things that they've seen or heard in social media or in the community. So I want to share a little bit about the pieces that I have in there because like many of our writers and contributors, I started with a place that grounds me in community. And I'm going to talk story for a little bit about those parts. One of the articles that I have there is in the chapter Language, Culture, and Power. And the article itself came from me wanting to write a story, a narrative of my own experience with racism and injustice, something that I can share with my students when I ask them to be courageous and tell their own story of not being seen or in trying to look for their resistance and reclaiming who they are. The article is about my indigenous language called Uchinaguchi. And it starts off with telling the story of my 8th grade self. When I was, as an immigrant child here, I was sent back to my island to stay with my dad. And I thought that after experiencing so much racism in this country, I was going to find home and feel home and be loved and included. But instead, I was punched by my teacher for speaking my indigenous language on my island of indigenous people. And I share that story because it was a moment that for me really shaped my identity as a person of color, a woman of color in this country, of the resilience I needed to find who I am again, to be seen in the school, in the community, in this American society. And so I hold on to that and wrote about that in the article because I remember that a grandma in the neighborhood said to my little sister one day, she said, "Don't ever forget who you are. Don't ever forget." And that really resonates with me because a lot of our students are taught to forget who they are, their culture, their identity erased as soon as they step foot in the classroom. And I really think that the fight in education, a big part of it is to disrupt that so that the students can imagine a more just world, beginning with how they're treated in the classroom each and every day. So that was my pedagogical framework in thinking about how to uplift, empower, and see the indigenous cultures, identities, and languages that are so often erased from our curriculum, school system, and pedagogy. And then the other one I'll mention briefly is in the chapter Anti-Racist Teaching Across Curriculum. And the article is called The Other Interment. And it is a history, a very, I think, invisible or unspoken, unheard history around Japanese Latin American peoples, 2,300 of whom were kidnapped from 13 Latin American countries during World War II, orchestrated by the US government to be exchanged as Japanese POWs in order for the US government to get back American POWs from Japan. And in it were families and children whose lives were not considered, who were taken into concentration camps on the continent, and then, quote, deported to Japan to figure out how to survive after that. I came across this history by chance because of a mystery in my family of an elder uncle who we never got to learn about his silence throughout his life before he passed. And digging into the history, I learned all of this, the layers of imperialism, racism, colonization, all of that together in the history that I've never heard included in the curriculum. So I created a role play with the hope that students can play the stories of real people who were impacted by this history. And imagine fighting for justice for each other. What would real redress and reparations look like when survivors years later bring back together collectively the history of what they had to endure and survive? And when I do this lesson, I find that a lot of kids really connect with those stories of being marginalized, alienated, dismissed, dehumanized in the way that we acknowledge history. So I created that curriculum in thinking about how to center anti-racist curriculum in the way that we choose the stories, how we incorporate the narratives of resistance from people that look like us, look like our students, so that the kids feel seen, validated, and powerful. So I wanted to share those two pieces, and thank you for this opportunity to join and hear from everyone, because it's just bringing me so much joy at a really hard teaching time. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Moé, for sharing your story and for breathing so much life into other stories that you uplift in your classroom. So much solidarity to you all, solidarity to the teachers that are navigating these dangerous times and trying to teach and provide classroom spaces that are inclusive and supportive to students. As we transition into a Q&A, I wanted to give an opportunity for folks to just drop your questions in the chat as I share a quick invitation. As we've shared tonight, Rethinking Schools, one of the things that I love most about Rethinking Schools is that the materials are story rich, centering the stories and experiences of educators, young people, parents, activists, organizers, when we are navigating a time where the opposition is blatantly trying to erase our stories from being told. So the more that we can center them and pass them down in print so that they won't be forgotten, so that they won't be pushed to the margins, so that they will be centered, the more power we can continue to build in shaping the narratives that undergird and guard our society. And so I'd like to offer a quick invitation. Last month, Rethinking Schools launched our Lifeline fundraising campaign as an invitation to ask folks to be our lifeline. We've been so overwhelmed with appreciation for the generous support of our community, and that's folks like you. Thank you all so much. And at a time when book bans, attacks on social justice teaching, anti-LGBTQ plus legislation, war, plague school districts across the country, we are sustained by the propulsive force of grassroots support. These factors, plus drops in book sales and increased operational costs, have deeply impacted us and left us with a serious budget deficit. And so amid a challenging season, it is our community that keeps us strong. You all provide hope, inspiration, and the foundation to continue the work. And so we are still raising money to reach our goal, and we would love your support. We're getting closer and closer to our goal of $250,000 by January. So I hope that you join us in continuing to fuel this important work, to share these stories, and to continue to fight for education that is liberatory, that is joyful, and that is just. All right, if there are questions, drop them in the chat box and we'll bring all of the panelists back together. Okay, everybody's back. I wish we were all sitting together. That would be so beautiful. But this is the next best thing. So I'll just pose a question to the group, and also to everyone who has joined us tonight. We would also really love to hear from you in the chat box. So amid this time of dangerous legislation and just white supremacist pushback on social justice, what gives you hope? What are the glimmers that you feel and experience? What keeps you going?
I'm happy to jump in and just say, like, just as a local example here in the Seattle area, just read a story about how the students in Sammamish, Washington, which is a little east of Seattle, at the high school there are planning to do a protest for an immediate ceasefire on the attacks on Gaza and in support of the Palestinian people. And that's significant to me because Sammamish is like an affluent suburb of Seattle, where like it's kids of like tech workers, and it's not a hotbed of radicalism here in the Puget Sound area. And seeing that, I thought was like, wow, okay, there's like, if these kids are organizing, it just makes me feel really good about the potential for the world and where things are moving, despite how hard things are right now. And so that to me was like an inspiring moment, inspiring tidbit that I got here recently.
I'm with you, Wayne. My son recently helped to lead a walkout at his high school against the genocide of people in Gaza. And that was moving for me to see that young people really understand and are feeling that pain deeply. And not just walking out in a one-off rally, but beginning real organizing efforts on a whole range of anti-racist initiatives. And it's been really cool to see here in Seattle, my son organizing with young people all across the city. And they had over a year-long campaign to demand that the city invest $20 million into adding more school psychologists. And they said that they should tax the rich, use the Amazon tax to fund more school psychologists in a time when so many kids are suffering, having difficult mental health. And I'm really excited to say, just a couple weeks ago, their initiative was passed by the Seattle City Council, and they had a big victory.
I would add that it's in the connections that that the youth are making to so many of the movements, past movements, present movements with Palestine. I keep picturing one of our sophomores. There was a walkout 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, I think 2 weeks ago. And during the walkout, his heart was racing. He'd never taken part in activism before. He was determined. He was feeling nauseous, kind of, talking through with his friends how, what he wants to do. And in that moment that he walked out, he came back in 2 hours later to talk about what that felt like, that he never imagined that he could take action, but that this was so important. How come everyone isn't doing it? And that courage of our students at a time when folks say the kids need all the historical understanding of what's happened in the Gaza in order to take action. No, they don't. They understand the humanity. They understand what they're feeling and how they want to fight. So I think that, to me, remembering those kids, each and every one of them that feel it, that see it, that mobilize to action, I think is the hope that I hold on to.
I love these. Just want to add a little sort of different one. The teachers in Portland Public Schools, just ended a strike that was almost the entire month of November. And there were a lot of issues and a lot of different demands, but I think at the root of it was this profound disrespect that the administration has for teachers, and for the capacity of teachers, for the initiative of teachers, for teachers working together around curriculum. And I went to there were demonstrations, there were rallies almost every day. The picket lines were incredibly well attended, and I remember in the middle of the rain going to Grant High School, and I thought at one moment, I thought, what feels so weird here? And I realized looking around that every single person I saw had a smile on their face. And it was just this sense of teachers being connected, and this kind of collective defiance, and we're not going to put up with it anymore. And so it's that, that piece of teachers kind of finding each other. And one teacher I was talking with says, we talk so often about that we teach together, but in fact, a lot of times all we do is share a parking lot. We don't really teach together. And so finding ways of sort of effecting that kind of solidarity as we go back into the classroom. And so anyway, the connection between teachers just recently here gave me a lot of hope.
So mine is, I'm going to try to not make it a super long story, but as Bill mentioned, a number of us as in Education Project comrades and Rethinking Schools comrades, Teaching for Change comrades were in Nashville for the National Council of Social Studies, which is a very not us conference. It is like just one corporate textbook publisher after another with like lots of flags, and truly like a cutout of Ronald Reagan, like a full-sized cutout of Ronald Reagan in the area, in the convention hall area. So there was just this moment of beautiful serendipity, which was that Bill and I were in our room getting ready to present a workshop, and this woman came in and she said, do you mind if I know you're presenting in a little while, but do you mind if I just can check the computer connection that I have the right cord that I'm going to need, because I'm presenting in here later this afternoon. And we said, of course. And she came in and she started looking at the computer, and I don't know why, because anyone who knows me knows I am not a social person, but I said to her, so what are you presenting on? And she said that she was doing a workshop called Palestine 101, or no, Palestine Crash Course, something like that. And we both expressed, Bill and I both were like, oh my God, that's so great. There's been so much silence on Palestine at this conference. And she immediately, like her whole demeanor changed when she saw that we were allies. And she then expressed how fearful she was because her co-presenter was not going to be able to make it. And she was getting some indication that there might be hecklers who would come. Just, she didn't really explain why, but one can imagine. And we promptly said, we've got you. And we put out like our bat signal to all our friends and comrades that were at the conference. And we said, like, there's this woman, she's doing a workshop on Palestine. She's concerned that bad folks are going to show up, and let's support her. And that afternoon, in workshops that maybe had 10 or 20 or 30 people, her workshop had 100. And there was not a single person there was one person who maybe started to, but quickly quit, was quickly shut down. And it was the feeling of being in that workshop was like, you heard a paper rustle behind you and we were like ready to pounce. Like, it just felt like this, everybody who showed up showed up ready to take care of her, take care of the topic, and really show up for each other. And so what's giving me hope right now are all the ways, large and small, that we find to show up for each other. And this is not a stretch to say that that is what I feel sometimes when I open these books, is that I can find somebody showing up for me, giving me that thing that I need at that particular moment. And I just say that with so much more authority this year as a teacher who's just struggling so much. How wonderful it is to have all these people over the last decades have contributed their work to Rethinking Schools, so that I, in 2023, can be the recipient of it. So that's what's given me hope right now.
I love these stories, also powerful. Thank you all. So there's another question in the chat that I just wanted to lift up for us. A great question from Mac Nair. If you were to give us one starting point, where would you have us start? Mac teaches 9th and 10th grade language arts, and all year long, they've been thematically using hip hop's 50th as their ongoing challenge to the system. Love that. So if we were to give folks one starting point, where would we have them start?
I'm going to jump in and I'm going to channel Linda's energy for a second, missing her dearly on this call. And something that I have to pause and say, before I became an editor of Rethinking Schools, Bill and Linda were my teachers. So I get a lot of my inspiration from both of them. And Linda often talks about writing the story, the read around, the sharing of that story. And Bill, I think you are credited for, used to say this to me a lot, you can't hate someone whose story you know. And I've kept that with me quite a bit in getting students to write their stories, their connections, and then immediately sharing it with someone else. Because once they find that thread with each other, then they feel each other's heart, they know each other, they're connected. And then from here, I think you can connect more to movements and the peoples and the fighters, the change makers of different movements, to help keep that hope, especially when we have to unearth so much of the ugly and the hurt and the injustice in our classrooms.
I love that, Moé. The quote actually is from a student of Linda's and mine, Janelle Yarborough. And so shout out to Janelle, who we still stay in touch with when we can. I'll be quick. I think, the lie about teaching is that we do it alone. And so the best piece of advice, I ever got was to, find a bunch of other people who share your values, your aspirations, and start a radical teachers group, and meet and share stories, share lessons, create curriculum together. You can't do it alone. And so that would be, I, for years and years in teaching, I was always in some kind of a teachers group to get support, and that would be my one piece of advice.
Yeah, and if I could jump in on that, Bill, it's a great point, because, when I get asked to go speak in different places around the country, I've been asked a lot, like, oh, how do you do it? And I'm like, you call a meeting, right? And see who comes, and then you call the next meeting, and you get a list, and then you see who comes to that, and then you call the next meeting, right? And eventually you have a crew of folks coming together, where you can start as both a support base, both in terms of emotionally and just surviving, even if it's folks just to whatever, have drinks or whatever, and survive it, but also an organizing base to like actually do stuff. I mean, when we started the Puget Sound Rethinking Schools group here in Seattle, so many years ago at this point, that's literally what it was. We started calling meetings. We were meeting in like libraries or people's houses, and it just kind of grew, and we decided to have a speaker or two and do some stuff around testing, and it became a thing. And then we got together with the Portland group which remember, right? I mean, this is your story, Bill, but like, the TGIFs, right? Wasn't that where it all started with like the movies, and like you just gathered folks and suddenly you look around and you have, 15, 20, 30, 40, maybe 50 people in your network, and you're in a space to kind of keep moving forward. And so that to me is like just a critical, but just basic thing. Call the meeting, have a meeting, see who comes,
Yeah, and people could call a meeting to discuss a chapter in Rethinking Multicultural Education in their school and see who shows up and start there.
And I'll even come do a Zoom session for you.
Wonderful. Thank you all for these great ideas, and thank you to everyone who joined us tonight as we prepare to wrap. Just want to express just immense gratitude for everyone who showed up, for each other who showed up for us this evening. It means so much to have this room full of folks who are just dedicated and excited and asking questions and want to collaborate and be in community. That's what this work is about. Thank you so much to my fellow panelists, my friends, my comrades, fellow contributors. Congratulations, Wayne. We're so excited for you. We're excited for this book. Thank you to everyone who worked on the book. Nancy Zucker, art director, art designer, to Lawrence Sanfilippo for doing the proofreading. There's so many people that were a part of this book process, and we are so, so grateful. Thank you to ASL interpreters, Tierra Carter and Crystal Butler for joining us this evening. And again, thank you all so much for joining us. We're so excited to continue to be in community. And let's get free.
Thanks all. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
There, everybody.
It's a celebration, so I think we need some music.
Flowers bloom.